for students to actually get what they need and what they deserve on campus, not being just shunned as, oh, it's just student food, your job here is to study. That's not the whole idea. So I think a lot of campuses I have seen personally, in many cases, that students do not have the right voice. And I think as Meal Exchange, that is one of our strong pillars to actually uphold that voice and support the students in any way possibly we can to help them be empowered to have their voice heard by the authorities either way. But I think another interesting thing, and I know we're going to talk about it a little more, Rahul, which I think one thing that Meal Exchange is hopefully going to do a lot is talk about in the realms of policy, because we need to talk, and this is something that we're going to talk a little more in details, but I think we have a very unique position in this country with our reach in so many different colleges and universities and post-secondary campus, that we need to have a conversation with our stakeholders on what a more systemic policy will mean to the students overall.
For sure. Yeah, it makes sense. I think that there's again like layers to all of this. The first is, I think, like we're so privileged to live in Canada, and being in a healthy democracy, in contrast to all the crazy news that we read about in so many other countries. While issues exist here, it seems like we're so much better off than so many other countries and people. So I feel grateful about that, and yet it doesn't give us a pass to address some of the issues that exist. You know, everything starting from reconciliation to just even the premise of like access to food while you're trying to better your lot in life through education. And so it can often be a thing that's taken for granted, where students, or it could be perceived that students should be grateful for access to education and a relatively low tuition rate. And while that's true, it doesn't mean that it's feasible or easy for everyone. And it's our responsibility to ensure that those issues get addressed, such that you don't have to make the trade-offs between paying for tuition and being able to afford good, healthy, sustainable, just food. And so I think from a policy perspective, that is one core component, which is around like the basics of food as a human right, rather than it just being something that we have to quietly struggle with while all of or much of the budget is being allocated to tuition or rent. And as we've seen, particularly over the past decade, the increasing number of students that perhaps are living in their car or are getting by with an insufficient number of meals, so both in quantity as well as in quality. And so I think that there's some fundamental change that's required to ensure that our fellow students, our peers, are not feeling or experiencing that level of vulnerability. So that's sort of on the base case. Then layered on top of that is the dynamic between like the sort of producer-consumer dynamic. So on campuses, we're essentially pushed to live in a monopolistic system where you have one landlord, which is the residence system, and you also have one restaurant provider, right, which is the campus food services. Now, both of these entities by no means are the enemy. It's not an adversarial relationship. Factually, there's limited choice. if you purchase a meal plan, which you have to do if in most campuses you have to purchase a meal plan if you live on campus, which means you're beholden to that particular system. But it doesn't mean that your needs are met. And if those needs have to do with religion, be it you're, Muslim and need halal food, or you're Jewish and need kosher food. So like if it's religion or physiology, like you're lactose intolerant, or gluten intolerant, or choice, that you've chosen the path of to be vegan or vegetarian or pescatarian. The needs of students are not adequately met on campus. And there's also this component of, outside of those three things, there's a values-based piece, which is if you choose to spend your money on food that is local or sustainable, or employs farmers and farm workers that are paid living wages that are not being taken advantage of. All of those things are choices that we would have access to in the broader world by choosing which grocery stores we shopped at, whether we purchased food from CSAs or directly from farmers, or we went to a restaurant that aligned with one of those values. The challenge is on campuses, we don't have the same level of choice. And so there's another sort of policy, sort of level that we want to impact, which is to help students ensure that their needs as consumers are met despite it being a monopolistic system. And typically that happens when there's representation, right? Awareness and representation. So awareness meaning that there's a surveying done of like, what are the students' needs? And then the food that's provided is evaluated relative to that survey. And if the survey sort of reveals that the needs are not being met, then there's change that's implemented to ensure that their needs are being adequately addressed. Now, in a monopolistic system, you don't always have to, you're not always aware, nor do you have to make those decisions because there is no other choice. You sort of have free reign to do what you want. Now, again, this isn't like a denigrating comment against food service, but rather a systemic observation around the lack of perhaps feedback that is offered and the lack of criteria that has been established about what is my role, pardon me, what is my role as a food service provider and what is my obligation to students. And then just like an employee and employer would have a performance evaluation, we don't really have that on campuses. So that's kind of a second layer. And then I think that there's a third piece, which is that there's some extraordinary work being done by other food advocacy groups off campuses, be it the Community Food Centers of Canada or Food Share, where you were the former chair of the board. Like, there's all these other extraordinary organizations that are helping to advance food policy in Canada, but there isn't necessarily that connective tissue between their work and students. And so even though there's all of this other policy stuff taking place, we're hoping that at Meal Exchange we can create more of a web that allows for that interconnectivity between those organizations and us, whereby the student voice is represented in their effort and we get to benefit from all of their policy knowledge in advancing the student mandate on campus.
Exactly, Rahul. And one thing I want to talk about very briefly about the survey that you talked about. Being on the food service side of it in quite a few years and being in the university side of it, I know that most of the places they do surveys. However, the key question there is meaningful surveys. It's just not a survey to tick the box that, yes, we surveyed our students, which in most cases happen. The reality of it is meaningful survey. And what rightly you pointed out is what action is coming out of it, which is if the survey says you need to do XYZ, is it really happening? To kind of hold the food service accountable in the, whether it be third party or universities itself, to hold it accountable and have the conversation on a systemic basis. It's not the point of, okay, my dining room needs a little more salad. That is not the kind of survey that I have in, that I'm thinking of. It's more of a systemic change that needs to happen in talking about food and addressing food on campus. Is that?
Yeah, 100%. And it's everything from influencing which provider is being selected.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, like how do we know, or what are the rules of engagement, right? Like, is it, if it's important to students to have local sustainable food, then are their procurement practices aligned with that value set? Are people's needs being met? What happens if you can't afford it? Is there a role for the food service provider to ensure that there's like a sliding scale of payment or some type of subsidy plan? It's all of these things because the food service provider and the university are in service to the students. The students are the customers, and we need to make sure that those customers' needs are being met based on values and based on offering. And that can at times be taken for granted when there's a monopoly.
Absolutely correct. Thank you, Rahul. This is a great start to the conversation. Uh, that brings me to the next question: is what are the challenges that campuses face, especially with the food? Do you
Yeah,
have
I
any
mean,
thoughts on that?
there's so many. I think that the first one is that change, and it's often resisted. And the campus food system and the dynamics between universities and campus food service providers has existed for quite some time, and it is a very complex relationship. As one would expect, like most things in life, the decision making is not everything that you would think, right? So as an example, sometimes like Coca-Cola could be selected as being the primary, beverage provider on campus. Not always because the needs, it's like servicing the needs of students, but sometimes because there's a sponsorship for the athletics team, or there's a kickback being provided in another area of the school. And that is not materially different than how most business works. The challenge is that universities are for the public benefit, right? And students are paying an increasing amount of money on campus to study and to live and to eat. And when there's opacity in that dynamic, it muddies the water. So that's just one dimension of the dynamic, and yet there are still a considerable number of students that are going food insecure and whose needs are not met, which requires some form of change. And so I think the principal issue that I'm kind of starting out with is that combating the existing dynamic and the existing momentum is challenging because change is hard, and there's it'll likely involve economics that whereby there was a web of money flowing in different places that the average person is unaware of. Even I have no idea how it all works. I just have like minor glimmers into the full picture, and so that on its own is hard. I think the second thing is, we're living in an era where there's just so much real-time feedback that's being given, whether it's on social or whether it's on sites like Yelp or Rate My Professor. Like the feedback mechanisms are so dynamic and accessible now, and yet there's still this service-based disconnection between universities and students that needs to be more modern and like the dynamics that we have with restaurants or Uber drivers or whatever it happens to be, where there's real-time ratings and then there's social pressure to change. So I think that's kind of the second one. I think the third one at the moment, which is extraordinarily complex, is that the nature of our campuses have changed due to COVID. And so, previously everything happened in that one bubble, and now similar to work from home that exists like post graduation, now it's a distributed student educator dynamic. And so what is the role of a food service provider in that context? How does a student that might be food insecure, how do they access what they need when they're not living in the same city as their campus? Who is their support network? Who's obligated to support them when they're living remotely? Is the price of tuition going to change given that a lot of those services were on campus and now they're off campus? So there's a bunch of things like that. And then I think that there's another one that's around voice and representation. So on many campuses, students haven't necessarily had that seat at the table where they are collaborating with administrators in the selection or the performance or success criteria of a food service provider, and ensuring that that representation at the table. Those are all challenges that we face on campus to try and ensure that student needs are met and that we're addressing that level of food insecurity, and that we're doing so in a way that's reflective of how we engage with all other services in our life with real-time feedback. And we can do so in a way that acknowledges the very curious and very sort of unusual situation that we're in, which is going from campus as the epicenter of life, almost as if it were a bubble, to now it's like a distributed bubble that kind of has tentacles potentially reaching out to you, but maybe leaving you in a more vulnerable position than you were in a year ago.
That's so correct. The COVID is such a complicated topic to just understand the complexities behind what COVID really means to us in the next semester or the next year. But I think one thing we touched on earlier, which I want to bring it back up again, Rahul, because I think it is,
I'm sorry,
which I think,
Suman.
sorry,
Do
go
you
ahead.
mind pausing you for 1 second? So I'm
Sure.
just doing like a quick check as we are going through this conversation, and I'm not going to catch it all, but I just noticed Janine from Lakehead asked, so what do you see as the mission of Meal Exchange? Is it campus oriented, or does it extend to lobbying with the federal government to change its policies on what types of crops receive subsidies? I think it's, and I'd love, Suman, I'd love your take on this too. I think it's campus as microcosm of Canada. And so if the beautiful sort of lens of Meal Exchange is that if we can realize change on campus, we can realize change off campus. And so if we think about the campus food system as a complex but still relatively manageable in size, and we're able to impact procurement and look downstream, I think we have the ability to influence or lobby with the federal government to impact those changes. The interesting thing is that it is a campus-based, it starts out campus-based, but then there's coalitions of campuses because collectively the campuses represent such a meaningful portion of food purchasing. And in collaboration with other campuses, we represent, or students represent rather, just a good sort of a good base of economic activity, a good base of like food procurement. It's all of these things. So I think it kind of goes single campus, regional campuses, all campuses, and then all Canada. So I think that there's a relationship between all of it, and depending on what students like are studying and their discipline, there's the ability for them to engage with other organizations like we talked about before, whether it's Community Food Centers of Canada, Food Share, those types of organizations, and think about the role of students in impacting these broader policy decisions so that it's not so myopic as being on campus, but rather connected into the broader food movement.
Yes, Rahul, I'm absolutely correct. I think the campus, of course, working on the campus is our priority, and it's always been. However, it is really important, as Rahul said, to understand the link between the campus food system and the broader food system in Canada. And absolutely agree that if we can make some sizable impact on campus, it will actually make a huge impact nationally within the food system, because there's a huge buying power on campuses. If you look at the 268 colleges and university campuses we have, and the number of students are on campus, it is a huge buying power. It is a huge economic power. And if we can make some kind of an impact, it will absolutely impact federally.
Yeah,
So,
and then there was one other point that was mentioned around like the commodification of food relative to local providers. I think I like truthfully I just don't understand it well enough. But from watching somewhat obsessively like all these food shows on TV, my minor insight into all of this is that the way you prepare food for 1 or 10 people is very different than the way that you prepare it for hundreds of people. And
yes.
Suman knows this deeply,
Yes.
deeply well. So maybe I'll pass the baton to you because I think that it's a complicated relationship between um, like volume scale and sort of small providers and sustainability. Suman, maybe you want to talk about that.
Yes. Sorry, I did not get the actual question, Rahul. Would you mind
Oh, so
repeating
it's
it?
really so that the actual statement or question was, I wonder what the impact of commodification of food has had. It used to be that local purveyors were able to secure contracts with institutions and provide local products. It seems that now it's all about money and not supporting the local economy and providing quality of food. Economies of scale have taken over, and that's also from Janine at Lakehead.
I think there is two sides of this conversation, and for those who don't know, I've spent a lot of years in my life in the kitchen running food operations. I was also the executive chef at the Vancouver Olympics, serving 12,000 meals daily from my kitchen. So I know the bulk side of it. I've run institutional food services in the past. So there is two sides of it. Of course, the economy is a huge factor that comes in place. However, to have, let's take, for example, I'm going to take University of Toronto, for example. There is 90,000 students on campus. On a regular year, our at University of Toronto, I'm just talking downtown campus, their food service sales retail was roughly around $15 million a year. So you see the vastness of this operation. And let us assume for a few minutes, if the university decided that instead of having a strong big food service operation, they're going to probably hire, probably you would need around 100 or more than 100 small mom and pop operations to manage that food service piece. Uh, do you understand the issues that the logistics will have on the university side of it? And that is a huge issue. For smaller campuses, things are a little different. I have seen in a few smaller campuses that the either the food service provider or the food service team within the university do look at a few small operations here and there, even in the University of Toronto, based on how big it is. For example, in Hart House, they had Sammy's, those who know Toronto, they had Sammy's restaurant, which was run by a mom pop operation for the last 15 years, finally 2 years ago, they went out of business just because once University of Toronto took food services in-house, the food quality overall on campus went up pretty decent. So Sammy's went out of business because they couldn't keep up to the bulk, for example, that as university, the buying power they had, the cost of food was a lot lower from their buying power. So they were charging a little lower, while a small operation was kind of buying retail or really high wholesale price, was not being able to keep up with the competition. So there is, as much as personally, I absolutely agree with the whole localized small business operation, but in some cases, it is always not feasible to do that. And as not only as a meal exchange, but even as a person in the industry, I'm always cautious about this. As much as we want to make change, we also understand that we need to make change through the system and not kind of always opposing the system. And that is the best way I feel personally that we can make a bigger impact. So it'd be wrong on my part to knock on university's door and say, well, you need 100 small vendors to run your food service, because that's never going to happen. If I ever say that, they're going to shut the door and say, bye-bye, you don't even know what you're talking about. So the reality is to understand what the reality is and how we can probably make a little more difference being in the system and actually focusing on what our ultimate goal is.
Agreed. Yeah, I think most my observation has been that it takes an ecosystem of actors to realize change. So even within the environmental movement, like Greenpeace plays a critical role in agitating. And then there's other organizations that approach it on the policy side, other groups that approach it on the corporate side. But you kind of need people burrowing from the inside out and others burrowing from the outside in. And somehow you meet in the middle and change is the result.
Absolutely. So one thing that I wanted to touch base briefly before this question, and I'm going to bring that because that is kind of really key to my work with Meal Exchange over the next years, is, and which I think also does not have much on campus yet, is student voices being heard. And I can sit here and say, I know all the challenges that students face, and that is not true. And that is where we look towards you as students and the students to, we want to hear your voice. We want you to tell us what your problem in the campus is and how we can support you. It's not one size that fits all. Every campus has their own challenges within the food system. And we as Meal Exchange, I feel that we are open to understanding what these campuses, how we can support and empower the students on this particular campus. And we are ready to kind of work on campus to campus basis to give that support. So I think that is really key. And I didn't mention right in the beginning of this conversation, but a lot of you are regulars in this summit already, and you've taken the using the chat feature so well, which I'm absolutely loving. So keep your voice, bring your voices to the table through the chat. We want to hear more. And I'm going to keep moving because I know Jamie's going to look at me very soon and say, you're going to soon run out of time. So I'm going to keep moving as we go. I think this is kind of what we were talking about in the past is, what do you think, Rahul, is the biggest impact that we want to create?
I think we want access to good food, right? That's the simple version of it all. But again, it's not like, even though it's an end state, there's components to it, right? I think one component is ensuring, like, starting out with voice and representation. Right now, it's almost like a parent-toddler relationship where you get what you get and you don't get upset, and that works when you're 4. It doesn't work as well when you're like you know, 19 to 24.
Even
And
my
so
4-year-old doesn't listen to that, Rahul.
yeah. So, so I think like we need student representation and student voice to figure out whether what is being provided meets student needs. That is the absolute base. And if it turns out that these food providers are doing so, high five, right? But if not, change is needed. So I think that's the foundation. I think there's a sort of another important piece to it, which is at the policy level. How do we ensure that it's not a choice or a trade-off between bettering my life through academics and nourishing my body and providing like the what I need to survive, right? And not just survive, but actually be healthy. And I shouldn't have to live a substance-based life on ramen noodles and Kraft macaroni and cheese, nor live in my car in order to pursue that education. So I think that there's a policy-based thing. Then there's, and then I think the other like important part is that there are so many possibilities to address this problem in ways that you and I and the entirety of the Meal Exchange team cannot even begin to conceive. And so we need a platform that enables us to identify the wisdom and the brilliant ideas of students, to invest in making them real, and enabling them to change their own destiny and the destinies of all the students that will come after them. So I think those are the biggest three things. And there's a fourth one that I'll mention and then I'll stop. But the fourth one is the independence. So not every, like it took me years and years and years to learn how to cook. We're still learning about like how, like whether carbs are good or carbs are bad, or what is the role of protein in my diet. There's so many, food is a mystery, and cooking is also relatively mysterious. And we need to demystify that. Because right now what we have is a dependent relationship on the provider. And just like your kids grow up and leave the house, and they do so hopefully because of the dynamics are such that they're trained about or taught about politeness, right? They're taught about work ethic. They're taught like all these things that you learn through your peers, through your teachers, through your parents. We need the same thing with food. In first year, the role of having a cafeteria is twofold. I think one, it's because a lot of people just don't know how to engage with food, right? The second is that they don't have access to kitchens. And the third, which is this premise that, oh, you should focus on your studies, we'll take care of the food. But then what happens in second year, right? Second year, when you're off campus, they just push you into the deep end. They're like, good luck. Like, I hope you can figure this out, which is where the role of prepared meals come in. But the more comfortable we are with fresh, raw ingredients, the more we're seeing it as a community building opportunity with other students to learn about their cultures, to one person be a sous chef, the other person be the chef, someone else washing dishes. We can build community and independence by demystifying food and cooking, and really enable a whole generation of students to embrace food and become less reliant on the food service provider.
You've hit it really on the head on this one, which is I think one of the biggest challenges with our system, and even from school, from even without post-secondary, even from school ages and high school, it is so important. I strongly feel, and I've been lobbying for it for years now, on the introducing of food skills into schools, high schools, because that is where the students will eventually go into colleges or universities first year, and without that knowledge, they are literally captives. And
Totally.
that is when the food service providers or the colleges or the universities, whoever they are, have got a captive audience and I'm using this term very lightly, take advantage of the situation.
Absolutely. And it's the same sort of rationale behind the importance of financial literacy. Like if you don't understand the basics of money, someone's going to take advantage of you, be it a bank, a credit card company with these APR interest rates. What we're talking about is food literacy.
Yes, absolutely. And I hope with our new direction, our changes, we can do play a little bigger role in that side of it as well for the students.
For
Uh,
sure.
so the next couple of questions, we're going to kind of club it just in the interest of time, is how do we envision we want to do this and how do we hold ourselves accountable? But I also, before we dive into this question for you, Rahul, but I also want to state it that this is right now where we think through our experience. However, we are always open to suggestions and questions and uh, input from students and stakeholders to guide us and make sure that we are in the right track. Is that fair to say, Rahul?
Yeah.
Perfect. Do you want to just very briefly say a little bit about how we want to do it?
Yeah, I think it's kind of fairly evident from this thing, but just at a high level, it's about um, it's not about us, a meal exchange, anyone at meal exchange, sort of coming in like Big Brother and believing we know what's right at all. It's really about identifying an issue and being there to enable and empower and support in whatever way makes the most sense. So that's kind of the first. The second is that what we can uniquely do is connect you with other students on your campus or other campuses dealing with the same thing, so that we essentially have a learning community, so that some of the hard fought lessons on any one campus can be used for someone else on a different campus to start from a higher place, or that you can collaborate in realizing change together. And then the final bit is around how we facilitate innovation and animation on campuses around good food. So that's things like facilitating, conversations over meals. It's supporting new ideas that come forward, both economically through an investment, but also with advice and guidance. And sometimes it's just being there as a good friend to listen, because this stuff is hard, and sometimes we just need to vent or commiserate, and we want to be there for you through all of that.
That's amazing. And how do we hold ourselves accountable? We have put ourselves some numbers based on our capacity. But as I tell the team that these are our numbers for now, and things change. Like COVID is a great example how it completely changed everything that anybody was doing, and we needed to reinvent the wheel. So these are some of the numbers we want to amplify and train and educate, facilitate on 45 campuses over the next 3 years. And we really have a goal to support over 100,000 students to have access to good food. These are bold, but the team here strongly feels that yes, we are ready to do this. So thank you to the Meal Exchange team, and some of you are on the, I think all of you are almost on this session. So thank you for taking this on. I'm really looking forward to uh, hitting our goals. So one of the questions that I always hear when we talk about theory of change, people ask, what is theory of change? Like, what does that word even mean? And so I just got a quick description, uh, what do you call it, a definition here. It's a comprehensive description and illustration of how and why a desired change is expected to happen in a particular context.
And but if I could just
Yeah,
add,
exactly. I was just about to ask you.
yeah, just a teeny like
Yeah,
simplification. It's really like, um, we believe that if we do X, Y will happen. That's kind of the theory of change, which is you have to believe that doing something will result in this desired change. There's a famous Einstein quote that's probably relevant for this moment. He said, if I had an hour to save the world, I would spend 59 minutes defining the problem and 1 minute trying to solve it. It's such a fantastic quote because it speaks to problem definition being key before you take action. And so what you'll see as we dive a little bit deeper into the theory of change is that the problem definition becomes critical. Otherwise, you're allocating energy to something that's not going to be the highest leverage.
Absolutely correct. Oh, I love that quote. I haven't heard of that quote before, but now I'm going to quote it every time. Meal Exchange team, keep that in mind. I'm going to quote this over and over because I love it. So what we have seen so far and understanding what theory of change is and the last 45 minutes of conversation. So this is a document that we have come up so far, what our theory of change looks like, and just defining a little bit who we are and what are our main activities going to be and what impacts we're going to achieve, the outcomes, and what are the longer and short-term impacts. However, I got to give a disclaimer here, which is this is still in a draft stage. And the reason it's in a draft stage because we need feedback from stakeholders and students like you on what your thoughts are and understand on where we are. As Rahul said very rightly and Einstein said as well, we are in the 59-minute stage right now. We really need to get deeper into understanding the problem even more and more, and then have this document as a path to the solution. I wouldn't say this is the solution, but it's a path to the solution. Rahul, do you want to add something to this?
I think we can send it out, just given our time. I think we can send it out to folks and would be delighted to have any feedback. And then perhaps we can host a separate conversation just to dig into this in more detail and address your feedback.
Beautiful. Awesome. So when we see this document, Rahul, there's a lot of different components. We have talked about it for the last little while. How would you summarize this that is easy to understand?
So if we can, go to the next slide.
Yeah.
I think this is in essence the theory. We believe that student voices are muted on campus. And when they're muted because of or when they're muted relative to the campus food system, problems result, right? Their needs are not being met. And the needs being everything that we stated before: physiology, value system, dietary needs, religion, all these things. But by empowering students to find and leverage their voice, we can help ensure that campus food systems are reflective of the needs and values. And that's sort of the beginning. But like all great things, when you realize or come to terms with your power, your individual ability to impact change, to impact systems, it changes life. Because now you kind of go from like an innocent bystander to someone that's just fierce and acknowledges their ability to change the world. And so we believe that by focusing in on the campus and by helping develop a campus food system that is reflective of student needs and values, that will have enabled this positive mindset to go and change social and economic systems post-graduation. Because as I said, once you can't unsee it. Like you can't unsee your own power. Once you see it in real life, everything changes.
And it's so powerful because, and this is exactly why we exist. And this is exactly why Meal Exchange exists, is to give that support that the students need to have their voices heard. So this is absolutely summarizes exactly in a great way our conversation that we have had. So before we finish, I know we have a few more minutes, and before we get into if there is any particular questions, I just wanted to outline what our next steps are. And as we said, there is a call to action here to the students. And our call to action is simple. You need to tell us how we can support you and your journey on campus to access food, good food that upholds your well-being. And that will also help us understand what we need to do over the next couple of years to support you. But as particularly next step of this theory of change document, we are now soliciting students and stakeholders like yourselves for feedback. We want your feedback. We want to hear what you think of this. If we want to hear if you think we are in the right direction, and if there is anything that you think that we should look into and have a conversation, that's what we want to do. So we want to get that feedback from you. We want to incorporate that and have a document which is vetted by our stakeholders and students. And then we're going to create, which we're already starting to slowly work on, create and support programs which is aligned to our goal through this theory of change. So that is kind of what our next, I would, if you ask me, I would say next week or so looks like. But it'll, because we want to get this done ASAP, and we want to get into the programming to support, because like I got to say this because this is something that really burns into me, that we are in a very interesting stage in the world right now. And I call it, we're in the middle of a civil movement. And you see everything else that's happening. And we need to jump on that right now and make the changes that we need on the campus food system. So we need your help today. We are here to help you today, and together make really substantial changes that's going to help the campus food service for you, for the generations ahead of you. Rahul, any points?
No, I'm grateful that you have showed up today. All of you that you've chosen to engage with one another, support one another, and that hopefully we can play a small role in enabling you to do great things on campus, not only for you and your peers, but as Suman said, for generations to come. So thank you all for engaging with us today. We appreciate it. We're here for you however we can be. Just know that we're well intentioned, and we will make mistakes throughout this process, but we're just trying to do our best.
Exactly. We did answer a couple of questions. I still have 3 or 4 minutes. Is there any other question that was really burning that Rahul or me we missed? Rahul, do you see anything? Because I
haven't seen any questions that we've missed, but Jamie, Jess,
if there is anything.
Brittany, anything?
The only quick thing that I'm going to say, if anybody has any questions, we still have a minute or so, just type it in the chat and we can have a quick conversation about it. Otherwise, Jamie, I see a couple of really great points that is in the chat. Is there any way possible to save this chat? So, because I missed a few chats for sure, that I can have a look at later on and see if there is anything that we can probably piggyback on or learn from.
Yeah, definitely.
That's amazing. So if there is not any more questions, then I really thank, as Rahul said, thank all of you students for a fantastic afternoon, listening to us and engaging in this conversation. And there is a question here from Janine. Will there be a standardized tool sent out for information gathering? We are still working on that. At this point, we are in the process of just soliciting anything that you want to talk about and let us know, just because once again, we are a strong believer of there is no one size that fits all. We want to hear what you think personally on your campuses. We are working on a small set of questions that we're going to probably send out to some of the students, maybe all the attendees of the summit, to get some feedback on the summit, as well as there'll be some questions regarding the TOC. So that should be able to align us.
Yeah, and so just one thing that I'm typing out, but I'll say it verbally as well. Given that I believe it was Jamie that sent out the link to this slide presentation, I would say I would encourage everyone to use the comments function on Google Slides, go through it, drag your comment over to the right spot, and please keep adding. And what we can do is, I think it'll end up being a great asynchronous tool for conversation, so that, you know, if Zoe types in a question and Sanjana agrees, or perhaps you know, Janine disagrees, like we can capture all of those comments within the doc and then use that to improve our thinking or to clarify language.
Oh, that's a great idea. That's a great idea, Rahul. Love it. Any other questions till we wrap up? Why do I?
Just a joke.
That's funny. Anyways, thank you so much for this lovely afternoon. I thank you for joining in. There is another session starting in 15 minutes, so a great time to quickly run and use the restrooms and be back for another fun session. Looking forward to working for you for the next couple of years.
Suman, thank you so much for facilitating this conversation, and a special thanks to Jamie, Jess, and Brittany for
Absolutely.
really just not only leading the organization, but sort of coordinating all this, and in particular to Jamie because this is sort of her baby. So thank you, everyone.
And even the students, they have been amazing. The student who worked on the presentation and everything. So thank you all.
Amazing.
Perfect.
Bye,
Have a good
everyone.
afternoon. Take care. Bye-bye.